Today, the City Club celebrates Black History Month in Oregon with a contribution to that history, an accounting by members of Portland's Afro-American community who have lived through and helped shape the social history over as many as the past 80 years. Before hearing their stories, it may be useful to recall briefly the early history of blacks in Oregon and the Pacific Northwest. According to Gordon Dodd's history of this region, a young black man named Marcus Lopius was a crew member on Robert Gray's vessel on his first voyage to Oregon. There were blacks also with William Clark in his Corps of Discovery and with John Jacob Astor aboard his vessel Tonkin. On the Oregon Trail, George Washington Bush came overland in 1844 from Missouri with a family and property looking for equitable treatment. He ultimately settled in Tumwater, Washington, and became a landed patriarch and honored citizen. Dodds calls Bush an exception because of his status and economic circumstances, and a history of his life and family exists. But for the rest of the few blacks in 19th century Oregon, Dodd says, they were known only to themselves and their neighbors, not posterity. This is true even of their institutional life, with the exception of the churches, with an African Methodist Episcopal Church Zion founded in Portland in 1869. What is known about the region's earliest blacks, says Dodds, like most non-whites, is not their achievements, but rather their trials at the hands of prejudiced whites. The 20th century has brought change for the better, certainly in the recording of important achievements by more and more Afro-Americans in Portland and Oregon. But the history has also been one of struggle and overcoming. We are indeed fortunate to have with us some of those who can tell this story firsthand. Let me introduce them. To my immediate right is the moderator of our panel, Carolyn Leonard. A native Oregonian, Miss Leonard's mother's family arrived in Portland more than 100 years ago. A teacher for most of her life, Miss Leonard began her education in Portland at Abernathy Elementary and went on to receive a bachelor's and master's degree from Portland State University. She's taught at the elementary, middle, and high school levels and at Portland State. She currently teaches at the School of Education at the University of Portland. Very active in Afro-American affairs in Portland and Oregon, Ms. Leonard has served as chair of both the Oregon Commission on Black Affairs and the Metropolitan Human Relations Commission in this community. She continues her commitment to helping make Oregon a more livable state by coordination of multicultural and multi-ethnic education for Portland Public Schools. Next to Ms. Leonard is Kathryn Bogle. 1911 was a landmark year for Ms. Bogle when she came to Oregon on the train with her mother from Kansas City. Her mother worked for a Mrs. Baumberger on Northwest Thurman Street, and Kathryn attended Chapman School. She later attended the University of Oregon in Portland, studying journalism. Mrs. Bogle married Richard Waldo Bogle in 1927, and their son, Dick Bogle, is a former Portland City Commissioner. Ms. Bogle can cite a number of firsts for herself in our local history, though she modestly says these were simply opportunities that developed and that she was available. These include being the first black person to write for the Oregonian and the first black woman to hold an appointment with the Oregon Employment Service. She's worked tirelessly over the years for the improvement of services and conditions for Afro-Americans in Oregon through her church, her Black Women's Club, and other organizations. She's helped promote the showcasing of local black artists in the community at the Firehouse Cultural Center and other venues. Ms. Bogle is still going strong at 88, with stories published this month by her in the Oregonian and its Food Day supplement. Next to Ms. Bogle is Charlotte Rutherford, a second-generation Oregonian whose father was born in the state in 1911. Her initial education occurred at Jefferson High and at Portland State. She completed the first chapter of her Oregon experience as a civil rights investigator and compliance officer for the State Bureau of Labor. Ms. Rutherford moved to the nation's capital in 1980, first earning a law degree from Howard University and then a master's in law from Georgetown University Law Center. After law school, she was a civil rights attorney working for the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, and then as director of the Black Women's Employment Program, both in Washington and in New York City. Ms. Rutherford returned to Portland more than 2 years ago and is currently serving as a hearings examiner for the Oregon Liquor Control Commission and is increasingly active in community affairs. Joining us at the panel will be Vern Chatman, who is an Oregonian who's lived here for more than half a century in the Portland area. He moved west in 1943 after growing up in Louisiana and graduating from New Orleans University, now Dillard University. His first job here was as a ship fitter for the Kaiser Shipyard in Vancouver. And then for more than 20 years after World War II, he worked for the Seattle, Spokane, and Portland Railroad. In 1968, Mr. Chatman was appointed director for the Urban League of Portland. During the dozen years that he headed the league, he was active in a wide variety of community and educational activities. And during that period, he also received his master's degree in education from the University of Portland. During the 1980s, he was a consultant to IBM and Nike for employment and training programs for minorities and acted as special consultant to the superintendent of Portland Public Schools. He has been honored by many community institutions over his long career, receiving distinguished awards from both Portland State and the University of Portland. I'll now turn the program over to Ms. Leonard, but please join me in welcoming these remarkable people to the City Club of Portland.
I want to thank you very much for those great introductions. I am very, very pleased to be at this podium with more than 300 years of Oregon history, the African American way, and it's really exciting to me. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking because what I want to make sure of is that each of our presenters has an opportunity to tell their story in their own way. I believe stories build connections, and I'm hoping the result of this program will not only be little vignettes, but stories that connect us as one humanity. So Mrs. Bogle will begin, and she will be seated. The others will come to the podium. I won't interrupt until the end. I'll summarize, and then there'll be questions. Mrs. Bogle?
The moment has come. I didn't think I should be here, and I'm sure that I've got people scattered through the audience who will give me my name because I'm apt to forget it today. I owed Carolyn a commitment to do whatever she wanted me to do because she went to Egypt with me and some other people from Portland Public Schools a couple of years ago. And things have not been too good for travel there these days. So I'm glad we have that one beautiful trip under our memory there. She tells me that I'm supposed to talk about things that were in Portland many years ago. I brought a page out of the Oregonian that was allowed, see, I told you, that I was allowed to do for the Oregonian back in 1937, and I brought it here and left my glasses at home. This is, it tells about the situation in Oregon at that time. Oregon has been really a backward state so far as racial adjustments have gone. And a friend from New York was in my home at one time in 1937, and she said, "Why don't you raise some question about this situation here?" Because there were white trade only signs in the windows. There was no black person, nor even a person of any other color that would be honored. But we were at the bottom, the black people were at the bottom of the of the list of people who were welcome. We were not allowed to eat in a restaurant. The sign said outside, "We do not serve anyone but white people. White trade only." And that was a sign that was seen all scattered all through the city. It was very humiliating, I must say. Now, maybe I better stick to this, because I'm not a speaker. I'd rather write. Borrow some glasses. Now, I went down to the Oregonian newspaper in 1937. I really was propelled by my friend from New York to go down to there and talk to the editor. He was very, very cordial to me on the telephone, and his name was Robert. I'm going to find that too. Robert C. Knotson. He was a soul of courtesy to me and heard me out, and I gave him a list of the things that annoyed me, and he heard me all the way through, and I told him that in the paper, black people, and men particularly, black males, were always described as somebody burly, muscular, and certainly without any attempt at portraying a black person as anything except an inferior individual. And that was all. There was no other kind of news, no other kind of comment in the Oregonian and any other paper here for that matter. So he heard me and heard my complaints and wanted to take me around the office, and he showed me all over the place and all the big machines that were spitting out news from all over the country and outside the country. And so I said, surely out of all of this, there must be something, some news about black people. And he thought, well, there could be, but they never pulled any of it off to put into the paper. And there were big things going on in the East. I could tell that from the Pittsburgh Courier and the Chicago Defender, which were black papers in the East, Chicago and around. So he said, well, let's see. Maybe you ought to write us a letter about that, and we'll see what we can do about it. And so I was just delighted to think that he was giving me his time, much less an assignment. So I said to him, well, how much space would you give me? And he said, what about 2,500 words? So I thought, right, that's great. So 25 words at 1 penny a word is the way they were paying then. That would give me $25, and I could say what I please. That was beautiful. And so this is the story that I wrote, and they gave me a page and a picture. And this was my son at that time. And it really tells in more detail than I can seem to find right now to tell you about. That's enough for me?
Yes, we'll have a chance for questions. Okay. You did great. You did great. Awards brought to you by a speaker, or by a writer, not a speaker, and I think you did really well, really well.
I have been asked to compress my 47 years and my dad's 84 years into 5 to 8 minutes. So you all will have to forgive me if I gloss over or probably inadequately state some of how I felt about growing up in this town. But I do want to hit what I consider to be highlights for my life, and as those things are reflected in comments my dad has made, and some of you may know my dad, and most of you, if you saw the TV series on African Americans in Oregon, Local Color, have seen my dad. Otto Rutherford is his name. His father was recruited to be a barber in the Portland Hotel and came to Oregon in 1897 as a very young man. He returned to South Carolina and found a wife and returned to Oregon with her and bore and raised 4 sons, including my dad, here in Portland. I grew up in the house that my father was raised in from the age of 11 years on. My parents are still together miraculously after 58 years, a record I'll never see, and living in the same house on the corner of 9th and Shaver. Talk about deep roots, right? When my father grew up in that house, though, he also went to what was then Highland School and Jefferson High School, which I went to 30 years later. But his experiences were completely different from mine, and my experiences were even different from my brothers, who were 5 and 10 years older than I. At the time my dad went to grade school and high school, he had the experience of being called a nigger nearly every day by someone somewhere during the course of his day. And fighting was a very common event for him. By the time my brothers came along, the neighborhood had quieted down, if you will. There were a lot of first-generation European immigrants who were in the neighborhood who came into the neighborhood after my father was there. So I'm sure my parents' family got a different kind of respect because they had been there first. By the time I came along, though, and I was born in 1947, the Vanport flood had happened, and black people in some numbers had begun to move into Portland proper. And by that time, after World War II, Williams Avenue had become the hub of the black community, where all the happenings were. We belonged to the AME Church, Bethel AME Church, which was located now in the area where either the Coliseum or I-5 is located. I don't really remember which because it moved when I was relatively young, but I can tell you that between Interstate 5, the Coliseum, and Emmanuel Hospital, what used to be the heart of Portland's black community was completely wiped out. Now with the renovation that's going on along Williams Avenue, people are saying, isn't this wonderful? I have very mixed emotions about that because I thought it was pretty wonderful like it was before. Some redevelopment money to make it better would have been good, but we didn't have to tear it down, move old people out of their homes, and completely dislocate the heart of the black community to make it better. That's my opinion. And for those of you who remember Williams Avenue, I'm sure you share that opinion. Because it had a vibrancy, it had a style, a tone, a feel that was ours. We could claim it as ours. But when you go out of the community, you saw nothing to reflect yourself. You didn't see it in the music you heard on the radio. You know, when I was a teenager, we had Fitzgerald Beaver from 8 to 10 or 8 to 12 or whatever it was, one night a week. And if you missed it, that was it for black music for the week, you know. These are not what one would call reinforcing or positive cultural environment. But at the same time, for me personally, and I was fortunate in that my community was broader than just what the white community presented me with. My mother was the secretary of the NAACP from 1949 to 1956, and my father was the president from 1951 to 1954. Well, if you recall, I said I was born in 47, so as far as I was aware, they'd always run the NAACP. And to this day, still are very much aligned in their heart with activities of the NAACP, but at 82 and 84 years of age are not that active anymore. But I came along during the height of their civil rights campaign for fair employment and fair housing laws for the state of Oregon. I can remember barely being able to read, but it being my job, along with several other mostly white neighborhood kids, to fold, staple, zone, pile, and otherwise prepare for mailing campaign literature for years. I guess because I was the youngest, because this was going on between, 2 and 9 years of age, it formed my reality. And that reality was one that was very positively black, without a question in my mind, while at the same time living in a fully integrated environment and living with two people, my mother and father, who had been raised in fully integrated environments. My mother's people had come from Oklahoma to Oregon in 1913 when she was a baby. My grandmother came here believing that the Homestead Act would provide them with farmland. And that probably occurred because my grandmother was a very fair black-skinned woman and had been given some white folks information. Because when they got here, they were informed the Homesteading Act did not provide land for black people. Ultimately, my mother's people ended up settling in Yakima, Washington, which also doesn't have a large concentration of African Americans. So both of my folks were raised in areas where black folk were pretty scarce. But at the same time, don't I have some of Mrs. Bogle's time?
He's running the show here.
All right. At the same time, well, where was I now? I'm sorry.
Sorry about it.
That's okay. Our reality for racist actions in Portland in my generation was completely different from the civil rights struggle happening in the South that we watched on TV every night. The "we cater to white trade only" signs were down by the time I came along, but at the same time, we skated at the Imperial on Thursdays and it was only black people. I didn't realize we couldn't skate Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and all those other days of the week because that was our night. I liked it because that meant black folk from all over the city could be in one place at the same time. And there were so few opportunities for us to gather as a group and be in the majority. Since my time is up, I actually have a whole lot more I wanted to say, but I have to say this before I close. Last night I went to the Urban League's Equal Opportunity Dinner, which was a great event, and this flyer about this event was presented. And there's a little description about me in here, and in closing, I think this description kind of encapsulates why Portland has always been a problem for me. This statement says, Charlotte Rutherford, a second-generation Oregonian, recalls her painful years as a teenager in Portland during the height of the 60s civil rights movement. She remembers her frustration with minority status, quote, quote, and with a community that was full of opportunity for whites only. That wasn't my life. I did not have a painful, in the context of race, teenage life. I have always found, and believe this is an example of why I have always found Portland to be extremely frustrating, highly irritating, and very tiring as an African American person who constantly has to interpret and reinterpret either what I am saying and what I meant, or what has been said to me, and what do those folks really mean. For me, growing up in Portland was frustrating in a sense that I always wanted a blacker environment. I got tired of being one of one or two or three everywhere I went. And for those of you out here who are not black, I would suggest you, for a minute, think about what it's like to enter a room, whether it's a conference, a social event, you name it, but have a gathering of 200 or 300 people who are all black, and you are the only white person there. Now you can tell me race doesn't matter, we're all humans, but in a practical sense, you know that's not true. I certainly know that's not true. I hope it will be true someday for our children or their children, but right now we see race, and we respond to people on the basis of how we see people. And a lot of us bring a lot of assumptions to the conversation that are inappropriate. I'll stop. I have more, but thank you.
For those of you who don't know who I am, I'm Vern Chatman, one of the original members of the Urban League of Portland. It was real invigorating to me at the program last night to take a look back 50 years and see the changes that have occurred since that time. I came to Portland in 1943, working in the Kaiser shipyard in Vancouver, Washington. I became the first black lead man in ship construction for the Kaiser Company in Vancouver. The only black lead man for a crew of 7, making ships to take our soldiers wherever they had to go during that period. My children experienced the same kinds of things other black children experienced. I recall a theater on Union Avenue, now MLK, where black children had to sit in the balcony in order to watch a movie. That is not true now. I can recall when my wife and I attempted to buy a home after moving from Vancouver Housing Authority to Portland, that the signs would go up sold, and the next day the sign was down. I can remember when, if you came to downtown Portland, you had to look real hard and for a long period of time before seeing a black or other minority person. That is not true now. You're not surprised when you go to my and Frank's or any of the other stores if your salesperson happens to be one of color. That was true. We would have a tough time finding that capability. That is not true now. I can recall when there was only one black teacher in the Portland system, Reverend Stone's wife. That is not true now. I recall that I applied for a job in the system, having a degree in education, having coached football, basketball, track, and tennis. My application never was considered. That is not true now. Urban League, after being organized in 1945, with the good work of Bill Berry and Shelton Hill, established a line of communication in the downtown area. And finding that there were some people who wanted to do what was right, we were able to integrate staff, develop staff training, make sure that minorities, particularly blacks, had a shot at those jobs. One of the things you probably never heard of, Northwest Bell Telephone Company, during those years had a black supervisor, an Angie Davis, who is still in Portland. With her assistance, we developed training programs so that black and other minority applicants could qualify for those openings. We had class on Saturday. Angie arranged for her staff to get overtime pay to conduct classes and choose candidates and train those candidates so that when they applied for the jobs that would be available, they had a chance to qualify. That was the way they were able to get the jobs. But it came as a result of finding a way to help the majority community provide an opportunity for equal opportunity. What we told them during those days was that equal opportunity means having people of color in places where they were not before. That situation has changed considerably. I don't intend to infer that we have been wholly accepted, but I do intend to infer that substantial changes have occurred for the better. There are people of color in most areas. Recently, we developed a training program with the Urban League Connection and the Nike Corporation. Previous to that, we had operated training programs for what was First State Bank, but is now Key Bank, U.S. National Bank. We were able to instill in some of the members of the Urban League who had contact with these organizations to have them implement equal opportunity, not talk about it, not have it written up in an excellent manner, but implementation is the key to people being able to take advantage of opportunity. Situation now is that with the cutback in various programs, it is going to be a little more difficult for us to exit into the mainstream. That does not defer us or deteriorate us from being able to qualify. Urban League, NAACP, and other organizations, Delta Sorority, Kappa Fraternity, all work toward improving the conditions so that our young people have an opportunity to participate on an equal basis.
Thank you.
And until that is complete, the job is not done. Thank you very much.
I cannot tell you what an emotional experience this is, because every one of the panelists touched on things that are part of my life. And the thing that I would say in closing, so that we can begin to entertain your questions, is yes, things have changed. It's all I can do to keep my tongue bridled and not tell you about my life. I'm not going to do it. I'm going to restrain myself. It has changed. The dilemma is some of us, some of our parents, some of us have nearly lived out our lives, and we are still fighting for equality. There is still racism in Oregon. We hate to use the R word, but it does exist. One of the things that I have found out is, for many of us, we do not understand how racism operates. And so it's not so much that we want to oppress other people, it's that we don't understand how the systems work to perpetuate what was. So in closing this part of it, what I would say is the story of blacks or African Americans in Oregon is one of tribulation and triumph. One need only read The Observer on February 8th and see the article where they documented Oregon's racism at statehood. Or look at the Sunday Oregonian, February 19th, 1995. Aryan Nation launches drive to recruit thousands to Oregon. In spite of the tribulations, African Americans have achieved, and they have told their stories. And I'm always a so what person. So what have you heard a part of our stories? I think it's important for people to understand the various stories, and for those who are interested, because we're a little over time, I'm not going to give you the list of the people and their accomplishments, maybe just to give you a couple of names. Mrs. J.M. Gates is an individual who's lived in Oregon for a very long time, who has donated collections of materials that deal with African Americans. One collection is at Portland State University. Joe Franklin has written a book and is with the Northwest Writers Workshop and is helping children document their stories and become published. Quintard Taylor at University of Oregon has written a book on the history of blacks. Joyce Braden Harris wrote Language Arts, the African American Baseline Essay. Lurleen Shamsuddin at Sabin Elementary School worked with children to document their various families' histories. And Dr. Darrell Milner continues to work at Portland State University. Michael Grice of Portland Public School did a wonderful documentary on the history of men working on the railroad. My father was one of them. There's a book published called A Peculiar Paradise, and it's available through the Oregon Historical Society, and I would say to everybody in the audience, if you haven't read it, you do need to read it. The history of Portland's African American community, 1805 to the present, was published by the city of Portland. So there are many, many ways that you can learn about the history and the day-to-day events of African Americans. The Portland Observer and the Scanner for everybody here. You need to read and hear about our tribulations and our celebrations. I believe that one of the ways that we can overcome the craters that divide us is to share our stories, and not only share them in a forum like this, but share them on a personal basis so that we can get to know one another. In sharing our stories and acknowledging our mistakes, we can work together to build a better Oregon. We can build a nation that's diverse yet strong. And just maybe, we can think of a world where peace is more than a possibility. Thank you, and we'll entertain questions.
I'd like to thank our speakers for sharing the wonderful stories and a wonderful part of Portland's history. But the question is, what happens now? If each of you had a magic wand, what is the one thing that you would change?
I would say what I would change is the way in which we communicate with one another. I don't want to see African Americans stay in their own little groups and complain about what could be. And I don't want to see white people running around saying, I don't want to be called a racist. What I want to see is people holding out their hands and taking a risk and recognizing that we can only build a better Oregon or a better nation together. And we have to take risks. We have to risk being wrong. We have to risk being rejected. But the net result will be a world where everybody can reach their full potential.
Ditto.
Just don't say ditto head.
I would advocate that 200,000 or 300,000 more black folks move into the state. I think that would change things.
One of the things that needs to be done, more emphasis placed on job training. It's one thing to want us to be included. It's a different thing to have us qualified. Those two things have to happen, the opportunity for training and then the openness of the interview. I would like to see more minority interviewers rather than interviewees.
I'm Steve Poland and represent the second question from the Education Subcommittee of the City Club. Our recent House Bill 3565 has placed a very high importance on building and maintaining diversity in curriculum in the schools. I wonder if you might comment on two questions. One is, how do you feel that schools, both in Portland and perhaps more interestingly across Oregon, are doing in this regard? And secondly, what suggestions might you have to the local school site councils that are now charged with improving on these elements of curriculum, and particularly how those site councils and their schools might take advantage of your rich local history that's going to help students understand the importance of these issues, and particularly of how you might help those schools see the personal example that you might provide to their students.
Portland, for more than 10 years, has had diversity on the table, so I think we're far ahead of the state. We're not perfect, we're still struggling a lot, but at least we've had it on the table. I'm really embarrassed about the total state of Oregon, and I say that as somebody who's traveled around the state and seen that there isn't diversity in many of the places, and it isn't even a consideration. I've confronted several governors just on the publications that we put out that show that diversity isn't even a consideration. When we show a sea of people and there isn't a person of color at all on the whole thing. I'm disturbed a bit about site councils in the sense that you only have so many positions, and when you have people elected and you are indeed smaller in number, and there are a limited number of spaces for community people, it's difficult to get the kind of representation that we need on the site councils. So I'm not sure that we're accomplishing. In fact, in Portland, my belief is, and this is Carolyn, Leonard, the person, the citizen speaking, that we've gone backwards because we've had in Portland Public Schools an African American committee and the Black United Front working with our district. We've had the American Indian Curriculum Committee that's worked with us for over 3 or 4 years. We've had the Hispanic Parents for Portland Schools. We've had the Asian Baselines Committee working with us. Now, the new structure doesn't provide for those people to have the kind of input, yet they've been meeting for years, some of them as long as 9 years. So they know what the issues are. Site councils tend to start over, and they divide the power of people of color. And so I think we need to work hard and discuss at length how we can involve all kinds of people at the table. The current structure does not provide the optimum way of doing that.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. It's been a pleasure. I'm Joanne Allen, City Club member. On the national level, the debate is brewing on dismantling affirmative action programs. Do you believe the need still exists for these programs, and if so, would you please explain?
Well, I'll try that one. Yeah. Yeah, actually, affirmative action and the assault on affirmative action was a recurring theme the whole time I worked for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. And yes, we still need it, of course. We never had it the first time. We fought about it more than we actually implemented it. But what has happened with affirmative action, which never has been fully understood correctly by most folks who aren't either in government hiring positions or lawyers trying to represent people getting in. Affirmative action has a popular misconception of hire any so-called minority person just because of their minority status, and obviously they're unqualified. Well, that's been the popular misconception that's gotten us to where we are. Most of the law that has been evolving around affirmative action have really been reverse discrimination cases, not positive. They've been brought by white males to challenge any kinds of, whether it's set-aside programs or affirmative action hiring numbers. My belief is, yes, we need to fight for it, but we also need to do more, because it's real clear to me that the courts are not as much of an ally to us as we thought they were going to be. And I think passage of the 1991, they finally get past the 90 or 91, Civil Rights Act was my wake-up call. We had civil rights in, 1870 and 1865, and then again in 1964 and 1965 and 1972, and we've got laws galore on the books, but without a public will to change things, all we're going to do is continued to fight in the courts for 20 years. We had a whole docket of 20-year-old cases, whether they were in school desegregation, whether they were in entry-level jobs in industries that had excluded black folk. We had so many cases that were old, it made it nearly impossible to take anything that's new. And as Reagan appointed most of the judges who are sitting in the federal court system now, and most of them were in their 40s and early 50s when they got appointed for life, we have a tough road ahead of us in the courts over the next 20 years to come. That's not to say we shouldn't do it, because certainly we need to fight, even if it only means holding the line. But I think we need to recognize we've got to develop some other kinds of strategies that we can more control, that's not left to the political whim of either the country or whatever elected officials we happen to have running things at any given time.
Nobody asked me, but now I can talk. I think we got acquainted. I want to exhort the women here to realize that it was women who spearheaded the civil rights law that became a law in Oregon. Maureen Neuberger was one of the strongest women in this cause. Lenore Robinson started a group of women just through a fellowship and a friendship circle that she extended to her friends in her churches and her other social clubs, and each one started their own circle until it was a fellowship group all over the city. And those are the women, included the mayor after a bit, who was, what's her name? You know who it was, and I can't say it right now. But anyway, the women were the ones who really pushed this thing. And I want to add this in the meantime about just black people. The prejudice spread to include the other persons of color. And during the time when there was white trade only signs in the windows, we as black people ate in Chinese restaurants. When we had to move around the city or outside of the city in Oregon, we stayed in Japanese hotels. There was never any discrimination in those places. And it was a wonderful feeling to be able to go into a restaurant and know that you could be fed as anybody else. So there is a comradeship. I have friends, many, among Chinese people. I have many friends among Japanese people, and certainly some of the high-placed ones in Japan now, I met through the World Affairs Council. They have been in my home. People from South Africa who are white and in charge of things in South Africa have been in my home, and Carolyn has met them there, who were white, and got some idea of what integration really means. And so I'm exhorting the women to take the lead, because the men are looking for power themselves, and the women are going to have to hold it up.
Gail Johnson, City Club member. I would like to know what you believe individually are some specific things, some tips, some strategies that you may have identified that will assist us in being able to not only survive but to thrive in what I perceive to be now a hostile environment.
Well, I'll start. I don't want us to have a lull. I think what we really have to do is recognize that we can't continue the us and them. We can't consider any effort to remedy the problems that we have being only for one group. Everything we do interconnects us. And so it's not about pushing white men away from the table. It's not about pushing people who've had an opportunity away from the table. It's about creating a larger table, creating the jobs, and advocating for every group, and making sure that at no time you exclude any group. And so what I would say is we really need to talk heart to heart about how to make more room, how to create more, as opposed to how to view that we have to shove somebody from the table and take it away from them and give it to somebody else. I don't want somebody else's piece. I want my piece. And I think that's what everybody is saying. They want their piece. And we can do that.
I think that as African Americans, we need to look at ourselves and help those of us who haven't come to a sense of self. I think this is especially true with our youngsters. And I think whatever the answer is different, kind of depending upon where you stand on the spectrum. But what scares me is the lack of dedication to the issue of equality for Black folk that is our heritage, that I don't see coming through in our young people. And I think we, as the parents of that group, have not done our job well in terms of understanding and explaining our history, giving them the positive side to being an African American that will counteract all of the negativity that comes at kids through the media, through each other in their ignorance. I mean, I think in addition to helping white folks understand how we fit in the world, I think we need to start looking within ourselves to help our own selves better understand how our youngsters are going to fit in this world. We've got to start taking more control of our own destiny and how we view our future.
We have time for one more question.
Lou Frederick, City Club member. I'd like some specifics from you. You gave a sense there of wanting to ensure a sense of where we're going with our youngsters in the world, but I'd like for each one of you to speak to a specific plan, a program, something that everyone here could do, or an individual could do for our youngsters, for a youngster. Are there specific things that you see, rather than broad general concepts, something specific?
We've got a lot of youth on the street, and basically what I see, I live in the hood, I see people who are afraid of the kids who are on the street, and to me they're children. People under the age of 18 are kids. And I think what we need to do is look around us in Northeast Portland and look at the programs that are operational, volunteer some time, because I hear people saying, I need big brothers, I need big sisters, I need people who will come in to schools and one-on-one talk with these children. They do not have the contact time that we had as children growing up. I grew up in Southeast Portland, an all-white neighborhood, or at least they told me it was white. When I got to school, they told me Italians were not white. But, but the people who took care of my brothers, because my dad worked 3 jobs, were white males. And they did everything that anybody would do with their own kid with my brothers. And that's how they stayed out of trouble. And so I think what we need to do is our schools have been cut back. We need volunteers. There are a number of programs that are operational around the city that need volunteers. And all you really have to do is call on the phone. And if you want information, I'm more than willing to field some of those phone calls, because we need to each connect with somebody in order to try to make it better. Nobody can sit on their hands anymore. This is a problem that affects every one of us.
I would echo what Carolyn has said, and I guess it's hard to be specific because each of us has something different that we're good at. And therefore, to say everybody ought to go do may or may not be where your strength is. But involvement is the issue. Whether you talk about involvement with your own children and their friends, which is, the first stage, or you talk about involvement in your church or your school or your community. But we have to get out there. We have to put ourselves out there, and we have to correct those things that we see that aren't correct. We can't stand back and let that be somebody else's problem because that's somebody else's child. So I really do think taking more of an ownership about the problems and an involvement, direct involvement, a personal committed involvement in correcting those problems is probably something we all could do more of.
Ms. Bogle or Mr. Chapman, did you want to speak to this last question? Because we'll...
Yes, I do. One of the things that I feel can be very effective is to piggyback on a program that they have, or at least did have, in Austin, Texas several years ago, and I was invited to take a look at it, is that in each of the elementary schools, the volunteers, people who are in the community and who know the children, know the family, they have a representative in each of those schools, several representatives, depending on the size of the school. And they get the contact from the older people who have the time and who have the know-how to work with young people, who can communicate with them. And when there's need for discipline, the teachers refer that problem to those community people who are there every day. It eliminates the antagonism between the teacher and the student. The teacher is not doling out discipline. And so the communication between the student and the teacher is aimed solely at learning, at being able to develop one's own personality, and the issue of right and wrong is determined by the people who do the volunteer work in the school from the community. That's something I think Portland Public Schools might take a look at. In fact, a number of years ago, I made that recommendation to the school district. To my knowledge, this has not been implemented.
Let me just say it's been an honor to share the table with such wisdom and such strength. These are stories we all need to hear, and to hear the advice that you've given us today. We thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to have you with us. We're adjourned.